Most people over 50 have a coffee habit that feels obviously harmless. You wake up, you drink coffee, and if cravings show up later, snacking, sweets, that constant, I need something, you assume it's willpower, boredom, or just getting older. Hidden biological truth. For many adults, cravings are not a character flaw. They're a metabolic signaling problem, driven by gut hormones, stress chemistry, and blood sugar volatility at the cellular level. But here's what almost no one talks about. Coffee can either amplify that volatility, or, if you use it with one small trick, it can shift the hormonal environment in your favor, so cravings come in softer, later, and less intense. In this video, you'll learn the coffee timing and composition tweak that may reduce cravings, stabilize appetite hormones like PYY and GLP-1, support insulin sensitivity, and help you feel more even through the day, especially after 50. Let's get into it. The premise, in one line, we're going to turn coffee from a nervous system whip into a metabolic signaling tool. And no, this is not a miracle drink. It's just physiology used on purpose, because small daily habits create massive long-term effects. Why cravings get louder after 50, and why coffee can be a double-edged sword. The myth is that cravings are purely psychological. Stress, habits, sweet tooth. The reframe is that cravings often come from predictable biology. The body senses instability and it asks for quick energy. After 50, several things tend to shift at once. Insulin sensitivity often declines, meaning your cells don't respond as efficiently to insulin's signal to move glucose out of the bloodstream. That can create bigger swings, higher peaks, deeper drops, more urgent hunger. The brain reads that as a threat and pushes you toward fast carbs. At the same time, inflammation often rises with age, sometimes quietly. Chronic low-grade inflammation interferes with metabolic signaling pathways and can make the body behave as if it's constantly trying to re-secure energy. And then there's muscle. Skeletal muscle is one of your biggest glucose disposal tissues, basically a storage and usage site for blood sugar. When we lose muscle mass with age, glucose handling tends to worsen, and cravings can get louder because the system is less buffered. Now, where does coffee fit? Coffee is a complex mixture: caffeine, polyphenols, acids, aromatic compounds. Some of those compounds appear to support appetite regulation and glucose control. But caffeine can also trigger stress chemistry, adrenaline, and cortisol pathways that can nudge blood sugar upward and make some people feel wired, then hungry. So coffee isn't automatically good or bad. It's a lever, and if you pull the lever in the right direction, cravings can soften. Because small daily habits create massive long-term effects. The coffee trick, the simple version. Here's the trick. Instead of drinking coffee as a standalone stimulant, you pair it with a small protein-forward or fat-forward buffer, something simple and affordable, and you time it so it supports appetite hormones rather than fighting them. In plain English, don't drink your coffee as a stress event. Drink it as a metabolic signal, and the reason this works comes down to gut hormones and glucose absorption. One of the more interesting findings in controlled research is that decaffeinated coffee, rather than caffeine by itself, can reduce hunger and raise a satiety hormone called PYY. That's a big clue because it suggests non-caffeine components in coffee may matter for appetite regulation. There's also evidence that coffee's polyphenols can interact with GLP-1 signaling, which is deeply involved in glucose handling and satiety. So the trick is not some exotic ingredient. It's aligning coffee with the biology you already have. Now let's break it down step by step. Mechanism, who benefits most, and exactly how to do it, because small daily habits create massive long-term effects. Mechanism, coffee's non-caffeine compounds can influence hunger hormones. Myth, coffee just speeds you up. Reframe, coffee can talk to your gut. At the cellular level, the gut isn't just a tube. It's an endocrine organ. It releases hormones that talk to the brain and pancreas, hormones like GLP-1 and PYY that influence satiety, appetite, and blood sugar management. If coffee components increase satiety hormones, that can shift how hungry you feel, even when calories haven't changed. In other words, you're not forcing less eating. you're changing the signal. Practical application. This is why you'll hear me mention decaf as a legitimate strategy. Decaf still contains many of the coffee compounds that can influence appetite signaling without the same stimulant load. Benefits: less hunger, noise, fewer cravings, and a steadier appetite curve. Especially for adults over 50, your appetite signals often become more sensitive to sleep quality, stress, and glucose swings. A calmer hormonal environment can matter more than a stricter diet. And remember, small daily habits create massive long-term effects. The common mistake: coffee as a blood sugar stress test. Here's the part most people get wrong, so stay with me, because the next part is where most people get it wrong. The mistake is making coffee your first metabolic input of the day with nothing else, especially if you're already prone to cravings or energy crashes. Why might this matter? Caffeine can increase stress hormone activity, and stress hormones change fuel availability. Your liver can release glucose. Your cells may temporarily become less responsive to insulin signaling. For some people, that sets up a pattern: alert, shaky, hungry, snacky. You feel like you need something, not because you're weak, because your metabolic signaling got noisy. This becomes more relevant after 50 because many people already have less metabolic flexibility, meaning the body doesn't switch fuels as smoothly, and blood sugar swings can feel harsher. So the practical move is not to quit coffee. The practical move is to stop drinking it like a metabolic stress test, because small daily habits create massive long-term effects. Practical application: the buffered coffee method, simple and affordable. Myth: you need fancy supplements or fat bombs. Reframe: you just need a buffer that slows the rush. Here's a simple way to do it. You keep the coffee you like, regular or decaf, and you pair it with a small protein-forward or fat-forward companion. Not a big breakfast if you're not hungry, just a stabilizer. For example, a small serving of protein or a modest fat source, enough to slow down the stress and glucose swing and keep metabolic signaling calmer. Mechanism: the buffer changes the physiological context. It reduces the chance that coffee becomes a pure stimulant signal in an empty system. Benefits: steadier energy, fewer urgent cravings, less snacking driven by a crash, and a smoother appetite curve, especially for older adults over 50. This can be a big deal because the cost of volatility is higher. Sleep, recovery, and insulin sensitivity all tend to be more fragile. Synergy statement: small daily habits create massive long-term effects. Mechanism: glucose absorption, GLP-1, and why slower can be better. Myth: hunger is just an empty stomach. Reframe: hunger is often a hormonal echo of glucose dynamics. When nutrients hit the gut, enteroendocrine cells release hormones based on what arrives, how fast it arrives, and where it arrives. GLP-1 is one of the most important metabolic signaling hormones here. It supports glucose-dependent insulin secretion and influences satiety circuits in the brain. If coffee compounds support GLP-1 signaling, and if your overall morning routine reduces glucose volatility, you're stacking two forces that both push towards steadier appetite. Practical application: this is why the buffer matters. It can shift your morning from stimulant first to signal first. Benefits: smoother energy and fewer cravings. Especially after 50, post-meal glucose excursions often get higher, and recovery can be slower, which can make cravings feel more intense. Smoothing the curve becomes more powerful. Synergy statement: small daily habits create massive long-term effects. Who benefits most and why it's especially relevant after 50? Myth: if you're not diabetic, this doesn't matter. Reframe: you don't need a diagnosis to have noisy metabolic signaling. People who tend to benefit most from this approach are those who notice patterns like, coffee makes me feel alert but then hungry. I get late morning cravings even if I had enough food. I do fine until mid-afternoon and then I want sugar. I wake up not hungry, drink coffee, and then snack uncontrollably later. These are not moral failures, they're pattern recognition. After 50, these patterns can intensify because insulin sensitivity can drift downward, sleep can get lighter, stress resilience can change, and muscle mass can decline, each of which makes appetite regulation harder. Practical application. Use 1 cup a day as your test cup and observe cravings and energy for a week. Benefits: less friction, fewer cravings, and more consistency, especially for older adults. Consistency is the real superpower. Synergy statement: small daily habits create massive long-term effects. Ingredient number 1, regular coffee versus decaf, a strategic choice, not a religion. Myth: decaf is pointless. Reframe: decaf can be a targeted tool for appetite. If the goal is cravings control, decaf deserves more respect than it gets. Decaf still contains many of the bioactive compounds in coffee that may influence appetite hormones, but with much less stimulant effect. Practical application. If you're sensitive to caffeine, jittery, anxious, heart racing, sleep disruption, try shifting at least one of your daily coffees to decaf, especially the one that seems to precede cravings. Benefits. You may keep the satiety support while reducing the stress response. Especially for older adults over 50, sleep quality is a major appetite regulator. If caffeine disrupts sleep, cravings often worsen the next day. Synergy statement: small daily habits create massive long-term effects. Ingredient number 2, the buffer, what it's doing at the cellular level. Myth: a splash of something doesn't matter. Reframe: small inputs can meaningfully change metabolic signaling. The buffer's job is to reduce volatility. At the cellular level, a stress-tilted signal can increase catecholamine activity, which changes glucose availability and insulin sensitivity in the short term. A small amount of protein or fat shifts the body away from pure stimulation and toward fed state signaling. Practical application. You don't need a complicated recipe. You need repeatability. Benefits: steadier appetite signals, fewer cravings, less energy whiplash. Especially for older adults, you're not just managing hunger, you're protecting metabolic flexibility. Synergy statement: small daily habits create massive long-term effects. The compounding effect: why this isn't just about cravings myth. Cravings are cosmetic. Reframe: cravings are feedback. When cravings calm down, people often notice a cascade. They snack less without forcing it. They feel fewer energy emergencies. They can go longer between meals comfortably. They make protein-forward meals more consistently. They sleep a little better because they're not riding caffeine late. This supports better glucose stability, reduced inflammation, improved insulin sensitivity, and healthier cardiovascular signaling over time, not because coffee is magic, because stability is magic, and stability comes from small daily habits that create massive long-term effects. Part 11. How to do it safely and realistically. Myth: more coffee equals more benefits. Reframe: the right dose and timing usually win. Here's a realistic way to start. Keep your usual coffee habit, but choose 1 cup a day to upgrade. Make that cup either decaf if you're sensitive to caffeine, or half calf if you want a middle step, or regular if you tolerate caffeine well. Then always pair it with a small buffer. Pay attention to the signal you're trying to change. If cravings hit late morning, upgrade the morning cup. If cravings hit mid-afternoon, upgrade the early afternoon cup and avoid caffeine late enough to disrupt sleep. And track how you feel. Not just more awake, but calmer, more even, less snacky. That's the real metric. Especially after 50, the goal is not stimulation, it's metabolic stability, because small daily habits create massive long-term effects. Who should be cautious or avoid this approach? Balanced and practical. This is still coffee. Not everyone should push coffee as a tool. Be cautious or talk with your clinician if you have uncontrolled high blood pressure or you notice caffeine reliably spikes your readings. You have significant anxiety, panic symptoms, or heart rhythm issues that worsen with caffeine. You have reflux or gastritis that coffee aggravates. You're on medications that interact with caffeine sensitivity, or you've been advised to limit stimulants. You're having sleep disruption because sleep loss increases hunger hormones and cravings. In these cases, the best version of this trick might be decaf, smaller amounts, or using coffee earlier in the day only. And if cravings remain intense, persistent, or feel out of proportion, consider bigger drivers: sleep apnea, thyroid issues, medication effects, depression, or blood sugar dysregulation. No shame, just data. because small daily habits create massive long-term effects. Final takeaways and how to make it stick. Coffee isn't just a morning ritual, it's a metabolic signal, and coffee can influence appetite hormones and glucose-related signaling in ways that may affect cravings, especially when you stop drinking it like a stress event. The trick is simple: buffer the coffee. And consider decaf strategically, especially if you're over 50 and you care about sleep, anxiety, and stable energy as much as you care about cravings. Reduce inflammation, stabilize blood sugar, support insulin sensitivity, and make hunger quieter, not through force, through physiology. If you want more videos that explain the why behind simple daily habits, without hype and with real mechanisms, consider subscribing. I'll keep making these so you can build a routine that compounds in your favor, because small daily habits create massive long-term effects.